Welcome to this lesson on dividing complex numbers and also finding the conjugates of complex numbers. Right off the bat, you should know that we are not allowed to have I, the imaginary number I, as a denominator. So we'll use the questions from this page to figure out how to get rid of the I when it's on the bottom. Let's go ahead and get started with this first question, which says 6 minus I. To get rid of I is pretty straightforward. All you need to do is multiply by I. For this question, you would multiply the denominator by I. Therefore, you have to do that same exact thing for the numerator. And now we have 6 times I up top, which is 6I, over I times I, which is I squared. Now remember, we learned that I squared is an actual number. It is equals to -1. So this is actually 6I over -1. And 6 divided by -1 is simply -6I. That will be the answer to this first question. For the second question, which is 7 over 5I, we once again have I as a denominator, and that's not allowed. So to fix it, we are again multiplying by I. If you do it on the denominator, you have to do that same exact thing on the numerator. So 7 times I is 7I. And on the denominator, we have 5I times I, which is 5I squared. Once again, I squared is a number. It's actually -1. So 5 times -1 becomes -5. So this problem then becomes 7I over 5 times -1, which ends up becoming -7I over 5. And now for the third question, we've got 2 over 3 minus I, and we now see this is slightly different from the first two that we completed. The first two, we had a monomial, just one thing as a denominator. For this the third problem here, we have a binomial. There are two things. In fact, we need to enclose that binomial in parentheses because it's a term. So to get rid of I when you have a binomial, you do something similar to what we did when we worked with radicals. We multiplied by the conjugate. Remember, conjugate is simply changing the sign that's between the two terms to the opposite. We currently have 3 minus I, so the conjugate of that would be 3 plus I. Now, if you do that for the denominator, you have to do the same exact thing for the numerator. So we are multiplying the top by 3 plus I as well. Good news is we've learned how to multiply. Therefore, we can multiply these with ease. So the top is 2 times 3 and then 2 times I. We would have 6 plus 2I. And the denominator, we have to FOIL this out. We'll take the 3 and we'll multiply it into the 3 and also the I. That means we have 9 plus 3I. And then we'll take this -I and we'll multiply to both of these. Therefore, we'll have -3I minus I to the second. Now, remember, the objective of us multiplying this by its conjugate is so we could get rid of I as the denominator. And that is exactly what happens when you look at this part. You see that 3I minus 3I is actually going to cancel out. And we don't have that problem anymore. However, there is still this I squared. But the good news is we know that I squared is simply a -1. So what's left here is 6 plus 2I as our numerator. That hasn't changed. But the denominator is now 9 minus the -1 that we got from I squared. So it's 9 minus -1, which makes it a 9 plus 1, and that's 10. So in some cases, you might see this as an answer choice, but in all honesty, this is not fully simplified. The reason why that answer is not fully simplified is because there's a number that goes into 6, 2, and 10. In other words, they have a greatest common factor. And anytime you have a greatest common factor, you want to simplify further. So how would you simplify this? Well, you divide each of those numbers, the 6, the 2, and the 10, by the greatest common factor. And the GCF is 2. So 2 goes into 6 3 times. 2 goes into 2 once. And 2 goes into the 10 5 times. So this simplifies to 3 plus I over 5. And that will be our answer. 3 plus I over 5. And now for the fourth and final question, we once again have a binomial as a denominator, and I'm going to enclose that in parentheses and also enclose this numerator in parentheses because it's also a binomial. Now, all we need to do is get rid of the I from the bottom. And how are we going to do this? Well, we need to multiply this by its conjugate. Remember, conjugate means change the middle sign. So this is -1 minus 2i. If you do it for the denominator, you got to do that same exact thing for the numerator. So -1 minus 2i. And this is just going to be a whole lot of foiling. So let's start off by working out the numerator. We would have 2 times -1 and then 2 times -2i. So 2 times -1 is -2. 2 times -2i becomes -4i. And now we'll work the second part, which is -i times -1 and -i times -2i. -i times -1 becomes +i. -i times -2i becomes +2i to the second. Now bear in mind that I to the second is actually a number. We'll fix that later on, but for now, let's just keep cleaning up the problem. So now let's go ahead and work out the denominator. All you're doing is a whole lot of foiling. For the denominator, we've got -1 times -1, and then we'll do -1 times -2i. -1 times -1 becomes a 1. -1 times -2i becomes a +2i. Next, we'll do the 2i times -1 and 2i times -2i. 2i times -1 becomes -2i. 2i times -2i becomes -4i squared. Once again, notice this I squared. We'll have to get rid of it in a moment here. So we'll just keep working through this problem. We go back to the numerator and you find that these are like terms. So we can combine them. This becomes -2. -4i plus I is -3i. And then for this part, we have 2i squared. Remember, I squared is -1. So this right here is sort of saying 2 times -1. 2 times -1 is -2. So I'm going to write this as a -2. And now we can work on the denominator. So notice what happens. The 2i minus the 2i here cancel out. And that's a good sign because we didn't want to have I as a denominator. We shouldn't have i's on the bottom ever. And once again, here's the I squared. We know that I squared is -1. So this right here is sort of like saying -4 times -1, which ends up being a 4. So I'm going to write this denominator as 1 plus 4. And I'm going to move this up here so we have more space to work with. So for the numerator, we have -2 minus 2. Those are like terms. So that makes -4. And that becomes -4 minus 3i, all of this over 5, because 1 plus 4 is 5. So this would be the answer to question number 4. So in summary, we are not allowed to have I as the denominator ever. And to fix it, if you have a monomial, like question 1 and 2, you simply multiply by I like we did here. And if you do it on the bottom, you have to do it on the top. That's what we did for question 1 and 2. To get rid of the I, you times it by I on the bottom and the top. And then sometimes you'll have binomials. And to get rid of I when you have a binomial, you multiply to its conjugate. The conjugate is simply taking a complex number like 3 plus I, and you switch the sign that's in the middle, which becomes 3 minus I. So the conjugate of this is simply changing the sign in the middle, so 3 minus I. And once you've multiplied by the conjugate, you should not have I as a denominator anymore. Also, remember that For question 3, we had to come back and simplify, or rather reduce our answer. So you can only reduce when you have a greatest common factor. And the greatest common factor has to work for all the 3 terms. If it only works for 2 of them, you can't use it. It has to work for everything. And that concludes this lesson on complex numbers.